So good afternoon, everyone. Thank you guys for calling in. It was kind of last minute, but we wanted to give this opportunity to the Kaua'i Endangered Forest Bird Recovery Project to go a little bit more into the Birds Not Mosquitoes initiative. So today, Cali Crampton, the coordinator for the Kaua'i Endangered Forest Bird Recovery Project, and Tea, the coordinator for the Birds Not Mosquito Steering Committee, will be with us. Thank you, Kelly.
Thank you so much, Mapu, and thank you for putting this together. And thanks everyone for joining us, especially at short notice. So my intent today is to introduce those of you who do not know them to Kauai's forest birds and put them in the bigger context of the Hawaiian forest bird community, and update you on their status and their threats, and then really zero in on this primary threat, mosquito-borne diseases, and our newest ideas about how we are going to combat mosquito-borne diseases. And for those of you who are sort of in the know about some of those ideas, Taya and I will bring you up to speed on the timelines for some of those strategies. And again, there will be a lot of information that is relevant statewide, but this is really in the Kauai context, or sort of the focus through the Kauai lens. So with that being said, I'm sorry, and my slides are not advancing. I'm going to have to go between two windows. I'm not sure why. Sorry, give me a second here. What happened here? My apologies. There we go. So on Kauai, we still have 8 native forest bird species. 6 of them are honeycreepers. 6 of them are endemic to the island of Kauai. So the other 2 are a thrush, the puaiohi, which is this big guy here, and the Kauai alapaio, which is a flycatcher here. And these other folks here are all honeycreepers. The 2 redbirds are found throughout the Hawaiian Islands. And to remind you, the honeycreepers are a group of birds found only in the Hawaiian Islands. They are an example of an adaptive radiation that occurred from a single ancestral species. And the group once numbered more than 50 species throughout the Hawaiian Islands and is now dwindling quickly due to the suite of threats that we will discuss in a moment, but primarily due to these mosquito-borne diseases. So here are many of the Kauai species, but also their relatives throughout the Hawaiian Islands. And I just want to back up a moment and just really focus in on the significance of the forest birds, both in their biological significance and their cultural significance. And that's what we call their palina, their biocultural relationships. So long ago, the Hawaiian people recognized these birds through their culture, the standards, the kahili, the cloaks that they made with their feathers. But they also recognized, as we recognize today, the ecological significance of these birds as pollinators, seed dispersers, and insect control. And so it's really important for all of us to understand that without the birds, we don't have a forest, because it is the birds that regenerate the forest. And also we all know that without the forest, we have no flood control, we have no water absorption, we have no erosion control in the Hawaiian Islands. So together, the birds and the forests are the backbone of the Hawaiian Islands, and they are the backbone of the Hawaiian culture and the Hawaiian people. So we need to keep this in mind as we focus on how we are going to address the threats that the birds are facing. Here on Kauai, we have 3 endangered species: the thrush that I mentioned earlier, or the puaiohi, which numbers approximately 500 individuals; the akikiki, which at last count numbered fewer than 500 individuals, and as far as we can tell, probably numbers even fewer than that; and the akike'e, which numbers fewer than 1,000 individuals. And akikiki and akike'e are both insectivorous honeycreepers. The threats to the forest birds are numerous and include habitat loss and degradation due to invasive species, the looming threat of rapid ohia death, which has been detected on Kaua'i, in Koka'e, although not so far, luckily, in the Alakai swamp, introduced predators, primarily rats, which attack their nests. And the big boy in the room, as far as the honeycreepers go, introduced mosquito-borne diseases, which are carried by the southern house mosquito, Culex quinquefasciatus. And that's the subject of most of the rest of the talk. The southern house mosquito was introduced in the 1820s. So it's not native to the Hawaiian Islands, and it's not an integral part of the food system. And it transmits to, or the females of this species, which bite, males do not bite. So female mosquitoes, when they bite, trying to get a blood meal, transmit two avian diseases, avian pox and avian malaria. Avian pox creates this necrosis that you see in the photo on the far left, which affects perching species like the honeycreepers, because it makes it so they can no longer close their foot and stay on branches. It can also affect their beaks and their eyes. And avian malaria, which causes, in many, many honeycreeper species, near sudden death. So for example, we know that the EEV is highly susceptible to avian malaria, and a single bite from an infected mosquito can result in death in 9 out of 10 EEVs. And it is driving, we believe, the extinction of the honeycreeper species. So far in the history of the Hawaiian Islands, the advance of mosquitoes and the advance of avian malaria has been limited to what we call the mosquito zone, which are the warmer parts of our islands closer to the ocean. However, as climate change causes temperatures to rise and our islands to dry out, the mosquito zone is rising up slope in the Hawaiian Islands into areas that were formerly refugia for the forest birds, what we call in this picture, the forest bird zone, in the high elevation areas in the interior of the islands, where temperatures formerly were so cool that mosquitoes and avian malaria did not reproduce. So up until very recently, the islands of the Hawaiian chain, especially the Maui and Hawaii Island, had these refugia in the middle of the islands where forest birds flourished because it was too cold for mosquitoes and avian malaria to reproduce. On Kaua'i, however, that area has always been quite limited because Kaua'i is a fairly low stature island. So I've taken that same general scenario we were just looking at in that previous slide and put it onto two different scenarios. So on the left is the scenario you basically just saw in that last slide, where you have a fair amount of forest bird habitat above the mosquito line. So mosquitoes flourish in the forest down in these lower elevations, and so there are no birds here, but above this line, mosquitoes do not reproduce, malaria does not reproduce, and the birds do well. On Kaua'i, because it's such a low elevation island and temperatures are warm all the way up the island, we only basically have birds on the very, very tip top of the island in the areas where mosquitoes cannot reproduce. And that situation is changing before our eyes. And our research is demonstrating that. So for the last 4 or 5 years, we have been sampling mosquitoes across the Alakai Plateau on Kaua'i. So this is that high elevation area on the top of Kaua'i, where formerly we thought that there were no mosquitoes, and all these circles represent different abundances of mosquitoes. So the hotter the color, the more mosquitoes we trapped last fall. So out here, these are the highest elevation spots that we sampled, and there aren't that many mosquitoes yet on the Alakai Plateau on Kaua'i. But at these lower elevation sites, which are about 1,000 meters in elevation, we trapped a fair number of mosquitoes last fall. This polygon here, this dark border here, represents what we consider to be the range of Akikiki, and then this beige color in the background is the range of a common honeycreeper, the Apapane, on Kauai Island. And here is a mosquito larvae. So we're also looking for mosquito larvae while we are trapping mosquitoes. So we know that before our very eyes, the situation is changing on Kauai due to climate change. And in response, the birds are in free fall. So this is Halapa'akai. Halapa'akai is this site right here. It's been considered the bastion of the Akikiki and the Akake populations, where we had the most endangered honeycreepers. And we have been tracking annual survival of Akikiki at that site since 2015. And you can see that the chance that an Akikiki survives from year to year has been falling from 2015 to 2021. Every year, fewer and fewer Akikiki make it from one year to the next. And another way of looking at that is the number of territories that are occupied by Akikiki at Halapa'akai. So in 2015, we had 35 territories, or you can think of this as 35 breeding pairs, 70 birds, breeding birds. And now this last year, we had 3 territories at Halapa'akai. So just in the span of 7 years, we've lost most of the Akikiki at Halapa'akai, which was the most numerous concentration of Akikiki in the entire range. Meanwhile, at that very site, we caught 50% more mosquitoes in fall of 2020. Sorry, this is supposed to say 2018, not 2021. So in 3 years, we caught 50% more mosquitoes. So mosquitoes are increasing in that period. That's just a typo. And where we had never caught mosquitoes in spring before, which is always thought to be the cooler period of the year when there would be no mosquitoes, we are now catching mosquitoes in spring. So the mosquitoes are invading and the birds are dying. And the way we are currently addressing this issue is through a combination of looking for and removing larval breeding habitats. So as you probably all know, mosquitoes breed in stagnant, slow-moving water. So we look for mosquitoes larvae in slow-moving water, and we can control mosquito larvae in a number of ways, including filling that habitat mechanically, like with gravel, or if it's weeds that are blocking the free-flowing water, we can remove weeds. We've worked with KRCP here on Kaua'i to do that. Or we can add a very safe bacteria called Bacillus thuringiensis israelensis, which you may know commercially as dunk, because lots of people use it to treat their water guzzlers and so on in their backyards or their pastures. We can add that to water sources, and that bacteria targets mosquito larvae and only mosquito larvae and prevents them from developing. It doesn't affect fish, it doesn't affect birds, it doesn't affect mammals or even other insects. So it's a very safe way that we can kill mosquito larvae. So that's this option here. We can also physically or mechanically remove mosquitoes with 2 different kinds of traps. So one kind of trap attracts mosquitoes that are female mosquitoes that are looking to feed on blood before they lay their eggs, with CO2 and a stinky BO kind of smell. And another kind of trap looks for females that are looking to lay their eggs in stinky, small, slow-moving water, or what we call a gravid trap. The trouble with all these methods is they are very limited in scale, spatial scale, and very labor intensive. So there is no way possibly with these kinds of methods that we could ever control mosquitoes across the entire Alakai Plateau. So the method that we are looking at with our partners statewide is another bacteria called Wolbachia. And this, we're going to get more into the details of how extensively Wolbachia has been used globally in a minute, but it is another naturally occurring bacteria. It occurs in more than 50% of insect populations in Hawaii. And when a male mosquito and a female mosquito have 2 different strains of Wolbachia in their guts, the eggs that the female lays are inviable. So in this diagram here, the male and the female are both carrying the same strain of Wolbachia, and an adult female eventually emerges, or an adult male eventually emerges carrying the same strain of Wolbachia. Down here, the male and the female carry 2 different strains of Wolbachia, and the female lays eggs that never hatch. And so this is a form of mosquito birth control. The idea that is being used to control mosquito populations worldwide is that in the lab, you inject male mosquitoes with a different strain of Wolbachia than is carried by your wild females. And then you release these lab reared males that have this different strain into the wild in greater numbers than wild males occur. So there is a much, much greater chance that a wild female will encounter a lab reared male with this different strain of Wolbachia than a wild male. And so the lab reared males will basically usurp all the copulations, and most of the copulations will result in viable eggs. And the result is that the mosquito population crashes over time. And this has been demonstrated in a number of places across the world to control mosquitoes that vector human diseases. So this is a tried and true technology in the control of mosquitoes. The thing that is new is the use of it in the conservation context to control a wildlife disease. And so we have developed a partnership across the state, across the Hawaiian Islands, called Birds Not Mosquitoes, that Taya coordinates. And it's a very, very large partnership that includes state and federal agencies and several not-for-profits that is working to adapt this technology from the human disease context to the wildlife conservation context and bring it to Hawaii to save the forest birds. And it's been a very, very long process because it's involved a lot of research. And maybe I'll just let Taya step in here and talk a little bit about that process and that timeline. That's all right, Taya?
Sure, yeah, thanks, Kelly. So Kelly explained a little bit about the development of an incompatible line of mosquitoes, and that has been successfully done in a lab on the continent, where they have created a line of incompatible mosquitoes. And so basically they're keeping a line of Culex clinicofaciatus, the southern house mosquito, the one that infects and kills our forest birds. So they have that line there available to send to Hawaii when we're ready for it. With one caveat, we actually have already succeeded in getting a state import permit from the Hawaii Department of Agriculture to bring it in. The caveat is that there's still some patent issues that are being worked out. That's been a major struggle for us to deal with, and a lot of folks are trying to make that happen. But once we get through that, then we would be able to bring in the mosquitoes once we go through all the various permitting processes. If we go with this line that's created, that exists in Michigan, then we would need to be getting go through the Environmental Protection Agency to get an experimental use permit or an emergency exemption. So there are a lot of folks that are poised, ready to do that if we can get through this one issue. There's another approach that we're also looking at, which would be instead of using a laboratory to create that incompatibility, would be to bring in the same species of mosquito, but from a different area that just naturally has an incompatible strain. So that's been being actively looked at as well. If we went through that process, then that would probably go through, instead of the Environmental Protection Agency, which is required to register those mosquitoes as a biopesticide, we would instead be bringing it in as a biological control agent. And I know we're all familiar with that process for things like strawberry guava or the willy gallwast. So that would be a slightly different regulatory approach. But in either way, we're probably looking at 2023 before we would really be able to do any kind of significant releases on the landscape. And as Cali explained, our birds, we're all very, very concerned because our birds just don't have that much time, some of the species. So I know a lot of folks are looking at all the different avenues or options for protecting our forest birds. Some of the other elements that we are still working on are just the overall, the work that the forest bird projects, the Kaua'i forest bird and the Maui forest bird projects are doing to collect that background information on the mosquitoes, the sampling, the surveys, so that we know how many mosquitoes are out there in the landscape. Because if you're going to flood the population with these incompatible males, so the females are like, oh, well, you're available, you're close. You know, hopefully they're not distinguishing between these two different options. We need to know how many are out there to begin with. And so this ongoing work is super important to get that kind of information. And then we're working with different experts to explore different options for rearing, mass rearing. It may be that we initially have to import the mosquitoes from the continent, just because we don't have that capacity right now to do that in the islands. But long term, we absolutely would be looking to develop that capacity and produce these incompatible males here in the islands. And then the other key thing, and I don't know, are you going to talk about community engagement, Cali? Or are you mostly done? Another key thing that we're doing is focusing on community engagement. So just doing a lot of outreach, working meetings like this, especially with major landowners and also community groups, cultural organizations, just to get the word out, because as you probably know, so many people don't even know our birds. And I just really want to give a big kudos to the Kaua'i projects for all the excellent work that they do to do outreach and to connect the community with the birds. So I'm happy to take any questions as well. You're muted, Kelly.
I know, I was trying to find my way back to my mic. All right, thank you, Taya, for explaining that timeline, because you understand the nuances of it so much better than I do. So where I want to go from here is to remind you that on Kaua'i, the alakai and koke'e are the last refugia for these birds. And so the work that we are doing currently is focusing on that, on those last refugia. And so the partners at Birds Not Mosquitoes have identified this area as the area in which we would initially release these lab reared incompatible insect males, the IIT males, to restore our declining forest bird populations. And so just here we have the Alakai Plateau and Koke'e State Park. And I've just put this map with the bird ranges and the mosquitoes here to remind you of why this is the area we've chosen, because that's where the birds and the mosquitoes that we need to target are. And this is a proposed map that is going to go through an environmental assessment process. It will be invited for public comment, as well as a number of other agencies will be commenting on it. And it is based on our understanding of where the birds are, where the mosquitoes are, and how mosquitoes move, both the mosquitoes that are out there already and the mosquitoes that we might release. And this is just our very first stab, and doubtless this map will change as we learn more and as it goes through the review process in the environmental assessment. But as Taya has mentioned, we're still a number of years off from even getting to a release of these mosquitoes. I guess there's a couple other things. I also want to remind you all that we're proposing to release males. And if it hasn't been made clear already by some of the other comments Taya and I have made, males do not bite. Males do not cause any annoyance to humans or to birds, and they do not transmit diseases to humans or birds. So that's why you release males when you do a project like this. You don't release females, which do bite. It is all, males are very short-lived, and all they're interested in is finding a little bit of nectar. So in case you didn't know, fun fact of the day for mosquitoes, males actually are pollinators. They're nectar feeders and they are pollinators. And all they are interested in doing is finding a little bit of nectar and finding a female to mate and get on with it, and then they die. No biting of animals involved. So in the meantime, there is a lot that you can do to help this project. So you can stay informed and stay involved as this project goes through the EA process. For example, we will be seeking your comments. We are at Kaua'i Forest Bird Recovery Project, as Taya mentioned, we are currently involved in a lot of mosquito research and control with those traps and with the larval control project. And we are currently seeking volunteers to help us with that, both in the field and in the office. It is an enormous, it's, as I mentioned earlier, it's a lot of labor. You can take your part every day to help address climate change. At the root of all of this is that this is a climate change driven process. So every action you take to address climate change in your personal life is something that helps the birds. But also I really want to drive home, especially if you do spend time in Kaua'i, that you can help us reduce mosquito breeding habitat. So to remind you again, culex breed in stagnant water. Anything that collects water will attract breeding female mosquitoes. And it can be as little as like a centimeter worth of water, especially if it's got any kind of nutrients in it. So I'm going to show you some examples, and I just want you to think about whether you have anything like this around your house or around your cabins. So you can help us. Let me skip to that thought and I'll come back also. So these are some examples we have collected in and around our houses and in and around Kaua'i and the cabins of things that are collecting water and we have found larvae in. So please, if you are up there and you see this, turn them over, dump the water out, but even better, just remove them entirely and stop leaving stuff like this on the landscape to breed mosquitoes. We have been involved in a really active partnership with Kaua'i DOFA to maintain the roads in the Kaua'i area because they have been sources of mosquito breeding habitat. And I am very, very, very grateful to Lainey Berry and Mapuana Sullivan and the entire Kaua'i DOFA gang that has helped to fill a lot of these ruts with dirt so that they no longer contribute so much mosquito breeding habitat. That being said, every time someone drives down the road, they have the potential to open up new mosquito breeding habitat. So we, in a way, need citizen scientists to help us continue to monitor and locate this kind of thing on our trails and on our roads, and let us know where they are, because we can treat them. Either Mapu can get the road crew out there to help fill them, or we can fill them, or we can put that BTI in these ruts to help reduce the mosquito larvae. And it does help. Our mosquito monitoring shows that it does help bring down the mosquito numbers. So in the short term, we could really use kind of like a bunch of mosquito busters or the SWAT crew, as we call them, to help, you know, manage this problem while we wait for Wolbachia to come to the rescue. With that, I'd like to say thank you to all of you for taking some time out of your day to listen, and I can take some questions. And maybe you have some questions for Taya too.
I have a question, Cali.
Yes.
Or for Taya. The EA that you mentioned, are we doing an EA separately for separate islands, or is it one EA statewide?
All of those things. So there is currently an EA that is a little bit ahead of us on Maui for primarily state national parks, correct, Taya?
And
it covers state land as well, so it's
forest reserves, and it's a little bit ahead of us. We are about to start the EA process on Kaua'i, and then once that's going, my understanding is Lainey and Cynthia and some other folks are planning on pursuing a statewide EA. Is that correct, Lainey and Cynthia?
That's right. The statewide EA will include other mosquito species, and it's been done in collaboration with the Department of Health. But for now, the East Maui EA is underway, and that's being led by National Park Service in collaboration with DLNR. And like I said, it includes national park lands, state lands, and TNC lands, and a little bit of ranch lands. And then the same, well, shortly, like Cali said, a little bit after that, there's a DLNR-led Kaua'i EA that Cali showed a proposed map for that is currently in, we're at the beginning of getting that underway, followed by the third statewide EA. We did the two initial East Maui and Kaua'i EAs because those were the most urgent areas to get started on. And we wanted to target the areas which were the most urgent to get mosquito control on the landscape to save forest birds from going extinct.
I think that the akikiki numbers from this year caused quite a bit of alarm among the forest bird community this year, and really accelerated the Kaua'i EA. And I don't, I'm happy to take any other questions. I know that Mapu is recording this for people who maybe aren't here to take questions today. So if you guys, if there's sort of like FAQ questions, Taya, that you often get that you would like us to address, maybe you could think what those are and we can record them. I'm going to stop sharing so I can answer out in the chat some of the stuff that's happening there. Do you have FAQs, Taya, that you think we should address?
Well, I think a lot of people do ask questions about the process. How does it work? And so we sometimes go into more detail about that. And then want to know, have questions like, is it going to affect, how will it affect the ecosystem? Like, for example, you mentioned that the male mosquitoes are pollinators. And so that's a question that we often get is, how will it affect the ecosystem? And so we answer that they're not, point out, as you did, that the first mosquitoes arrived only 200 years ago, and our birds and our ecosystems evolved over millennia, millions of years. And so they're not really considered an integral part of the ecosystem. Another question that we get might have to do with, can I get it? If you're releasing all these mosquitoes, is it possible that either I or some other animal is going to end up with Wolbachia in it? And so then we would explain that Wolbachia is really, it uses arthropods, really arthropods and nematodes as its host. So it uses invertebrate hosts. It's not known to infect humans. And even if it did, remember that, as you pointed out, we're only releasing the males, which don't bite. So even then it couldn't be transmitted by a bite because it's passed maternally by the female. Luca, can you think of Luca is our outreach associate. He's also on the call. Can you think of some other FAQs that you've been working on recently?
Oh, wait, sorry. So I think other than the ones that you said, we had questions about how are we making sure that we only have females. And so there is both a manual process. The eggs are different sizes between the males and the females, and also the adult mosquitoes themselves also has some character differences. There is also AI technology. As technology is advancing, we're also able to use AI to sort through both the males and the females to reduce the possibility of female release. Another one is if for some reason mosquitoes are very important to our ecosystem, what can we do? And this process is reversible. All we have to do is start releasing mosquitoes that have a compatible Wolbachia again, and the mosquito population will rebound. So no genetics. Another one is like no genetics are being modified. This is just basically swapping one infection for a different infection.
And the infection occurs naturally. I mean, mosquitoes carry Wolbachia naturally. My understanding is it's a gut symbiont, right?
Yeah, it's interesting. So they estimate that more than 50 to 60% of all insects carry Wolbachia. In Hawaii, there is Wolbachia in naturally occurring in the Asian tiger mosquito. That's the one that caused so much problems with dengue, has the little white on the legs. If you actually ever get close up and personal with your mosquitoes. And the Culex, by the way, that southern house mosquito is the one that bites. It's a night biter. So if you're getting bitten at night, you do have this species around you. But the Aedes aegypti, which is really mostly found on Hawaii Island, does not naturally carry Wolbachia. So it does vary. And even in Hawaii, it's actually about only 14% of the known, that's the only estimate that's been done, but the only study that's been done is about 14% of our insect species carry Wolbachia. But that includes, I find super interesting that includes the wettiu bug, which is one that's found in really extreme environments.
Do any Kaua'i folks have any Kaua'i specific questions?
I have a more general question.
Sure.
It might be, I don't know if this is something out of the ordinary, but there's a vaccine for human malaria now. And I was wondering if there was a way to protect the birds themselves instead of trying to limit the mosquitoes. Because there's a lot of great ways to limit mosquitoes, but would there be a way for say, vaccinate birds?
I think that the context in which we've thought about vaccination for birds is, should we need to capture birds to say translocate them to another island, or should we have birds in captivity for other reasons? We might then vaccinate them before returning them to the wild. But it is so difficult to capture these birds that we think that vaccination as a tool for the wild population, it would be very difficult because you would just have to lay hands on so many birds, and it's unlikely, the vaccinations aren't hereditary. So you'd have to then catch the next generation and the next generation. So addressing the mosquito problem hopefully gives us more bang for our buck.
Is there a vaccine that exists to the same effect or no?
Experimental ones, is my understanding, have been trialed on some species like penguins, for example.
Okay, so it would be more of if you had a breeding pair in a zoo kind of thing, you'd give them a vaccine. Okay, that makes sense. Thanks.
It is an interesting question, and one other approach that some folks are using for public health purposes for human-borne diseases and mosquitoes is actually sometimes if you're using a particular strain of Wolbachia, or maybe even a super strain or combination of strains, it can actually block the transmission of disease. And so that would be a way that, if at least if the mosquitoes that were out there, if you can't get rid of them, if you were able to have ones that were not able to transmit the disease, that's something that's actively being looked into in a research lab on the continent for our southern house mosquito, looking at having a couple of different strains added to the mosquito. But that would actually be a different approach, because if that's the way you were going, you would want to be kind of replacing the whole population. So you wouldn't be trying to suppress it. You'd be trying to get ones out there that are not going to transmit the disease. And that would actually require a different kind of regulatory approach that would be more like a food and drug approval thing, which we figure would take a lot longer. And so we want whatever we think we can get out there that will be effective in the shortest amount of time possible.
Thank you very much. It was a very interesting talk as well. Thanks.
We are, you know, we talked about, we need to come up with some better names for our species because we tend to talk about them as Culex quinquefasciatus or Aedes aegypti or Aedes albopictus, and most people just sort of stare blankly at you when you're using these names. So if you have any suggestions, we can also use help coming up with names that you think would be helpful for ways to talk about our species.
Bad guy names?
Yeah, bad guy names, or I don't know if we end up having to go with I don't know if we'd want a Hawaiian name. Like I know Makika, people try to use names that are not, don't make it sound like it belongs here.
Hmm. So no Kaua'i specific questions?
Cali, Cali, this is Fern and Taya. I think, you know, in ArcGIS, it's possible to look at a landscape and look at the degree of slope on any given landscape. And I think it's really going to be important to figure out which areas are going to be difficult, if not impossible, in a release scenario for Wolbachia mosquitoes to actually pull this off logistically in a way that is going to leave no mosquito gaps and good coverage of mosquitoes in the environment. And I know for Hanavi, there's going to be many areas that are of such a slope and difficulty to achieve of getting to. There has to be some planning for, I don't know, drone deployments of releases or things like that, where it's humanly not possible to cover areas. And I wonder if anybody is looking at the logistics and the actual management of releases so that things can happen in a timely manner.
Yeah, that's a great question, Fern. And we are actively exploring those different elements because it doesn't do us any good to have this great tool if we can't get it where it needs to go. And so drones is one option. Also looking at use of helicopter long line for deploying the mosquitoes. And just recently, I think it's been suggested to look into the same technique that was used for BTS, brown tree snake deployment. I'm not familiar enough with that to see how that would work. But all of those things are being looked at. One odd benefit to the species that we're targeting is that, and it's odd in a way, but the house mosquito, the Culex mosquito, it tends to disperse. So it can move 1 or 2 kilometers. And so unlike the tiger mosquito that tends to just hang around the houses, they really don't go very far. So it's kind of to our advantage, the fact that we expect that we don't have to fully saturate every area, that they're going to be pretty good at, you know, we're hoping they're going to be good at finding each other. It's definitely a valid concern that you've raised and one that we're actively working on how to do the best approach, and it will probably be a mix. So on foot in some places, and then potentially drone and or helicopter, while also being very sensitive to the question of looking at the impact. That's what the environmental assessments will do, is because impact not just to the environment, but you know, not just to the desired impact that we have, but also wanting to be sure that we're minimizing to the extent possible any impacts on people or areas. Of course, most of these areas are in areas that aren't occupied by people for the most part.
We discussed this yesterday in a meeting on Kaua'i, and the northwestern part of our project area is actually full of roads and trails. So that will be to our benefit as far as access. It will make it a lot easier. And then the southeastern part of the area is obviously the Alakai Plateau, you know, plateau proper is roadless, but has lots of good LZs. And I have talked at length with Adam Borsino about how we might use different LZs and a combination of different technologies to get into those areas, either with a helicopter or drone, and deploy mosquitoes throughout those areas. I'm not seeing any more questions. Lainey or Cynthia, is there anything you want to add from our discussions yesterday about the Kaua'i process?
No, I think you did a good job of summarizing it.
Well, thank you again for your time, and I'm available if via email if people want to reach out to me and ask some follow-up questions. Here for you, and I am doing this talk again in Kaua'i, so please spread the word. We do really want to reach out to the people who have cabins in Kaua'i, because some of those cabins are in the proposed area, and we want to address any concerns or questions they might have. So please let them know that I'll be up there. Is it the 10th, Mapu?
Yes.
10th at 10 or 11, I think, at the DNLR cabin. And this is just going to be the first of many, many opportunities people will have to engage with us. We're just at the very beginning of this process. So just stay, I guess, in touch. Kaua'i Forest Bird Recovery Project does have a mailing list on our website, kauaiforestbirds.org. So if you want to get quarterly updates on things that we're up to, then please sign up there.
Thank you, Cali and Tia. Would you guys want to put your contact information maybe in the chat, just in case people wanted to reach out to you guys personally as well? And then if anyone wants the recording, we can send this around and have it available to distribute as well. So, thank you, everyone.
Yeah, my info is in the chat already. Because somebody asked about volunteering, so that's the best way to reach us.
Thanks.
Thank
and,
you.
and Luca,
Thanks for hosting,
also,
Mapu.
Yeah, Luca also added our website information, and look for us on social media.
Yeah.
Thanks.
Thank
Thanks,
you.
everybody.
Bye.
Bye.